Stories are powerful. Welcome to another episode of The Book in You with Dr. Tim Elmore and Jared Cagle. That's me. We can't wait to dive into the content today. Today, an increasing number of leaders and communicators are talking about the power of using stories when casting vision, when passing on information, or teaching on any sort of topic or lesson. And we want to talk to you today about how you can better leverage the power of your stories.
Well, Jared is right, listeners. We both believe, and you probably do too, that when you insert a story into a chapter of a book you're writing or a talk you're giving, it just brings it to life. And it's because of how our brains are wired. So let me illustrate. Way back in 1954, publisher Bennett Cerf, he was the co-founder of Random House, read a Life magazine article that was entitled, "Why Do Students Bog Down at the First R?" And of course, it's talking about reading, writing, arithmetic. Basically, at the time, mid-1950s, kids' reading scores were just dropping. They weren't reading books. Does this sound familiar, by the way? So a few years go by, and by 1960, Bennett Cerf, this publisher, is sitting down with Theodore Geisel, who you know, but I'll reveal him in just a moment if you can't remember that name. And he said to Geisel, "I'll give you $1 a word if you can write a book with less than 50 words, but I want you to insert all kind of pictures and stories." Well, Theodore Geisel won the bet. He wrote a book with just under 50 words. And of course, he got paid $1. The bet was $1 a word, so he wasn't going to make much. But just that challenge alone absolutely ignited Theodore Geisel. And if you know his name, Theodore Geisel is Dr. Seuss. And that book, Green Eggs and Ham, sold over 200 million copies. I know. So I think it did okay. In fact, he never got the $50, but he was fine. I'm fine. You don't need to pay that. I'm okay. But here's what I'm going to contend with you listeners. What made a difference in that book was there were so few words that Geisel had to lean on. Dr. Seuss had to lean on the story, the zany story, and the imagery. I love we all recognize Dr. Seuss's pictures, don't we? His style of artwork. So its genius, this book, its genius was the images and the story. And so listeners, I'm thinking, as you think about writing your next book, is there enough imagery and is there enough story? Believe it or not, Theodore Geisel's first successful children's book was not Green Eggs and Ham. It was one that came before, but it was also written on a challenge. William Spalding, who worked with Houghton Mifflin, challenged Dr. Seuss to write a book using a limited number of distinct words. He wanted him to write it in 225 words, and those words had to fit into a list that was appropriate for a first grader. So in other words, American education at the time said first graders ought to understand about 225 words. Can you write a book that all first graders would understand? Well, Jared, this is way before your time, but I remember growing up way back 50, 60 years ago, the books for kids were like, See Dick and Jane Run, Run Spot Run. It was pretty sad. And it wasn't engaging. And the story really was nothing. But once again, Dr. Seuss writes this book. Now, he lost the bet because he used 348 words, but his book, The Cat in the Hat, went on to sell 15 million copies. So there's a pattern we're finding here. And I want you to capture this, listeners. The book was simple. It was a page turner because you could hardly wait for the next part of the story. What zany thing is going to happen? And the imagery, all of this feeds the brain where it makes it memorable. So I'm simply suggesting maybe Dr. Seuss has something to teach you and I today, even though we may not be writing to children, we're writing to adults. And it's all about this power of story and imagery.
How fascinating! How that Dr. Seuss, without Instagram,
Yeah, that's right.
He realized the importance of imagery. And of course I joke about Instagram, but we have multiple platforms now that are derived and built on the image. And so we're now being trained, and not only to be visual learners in our wiring, but now we're being conditioned that way too in our everyday life. It's more messages in visual form, imagery. And I also think it's fascinating that the Cat in the Hat was less popular than Green Eggs and Ham. I don't know that I would have guessed that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but the words is a big part of
It,
it. Yep.
yeah, it is. I think it was probably because the Cat in the Hat came first, and that maybe built his following a bit. That led to an increased number, but the principles. I mean, if you think about the zany story of this cat visiting this house, and mom and dad are gone, and the two kids are home, all that stuff. Well, every one of us are remembering our childhood, and we're thinking, I'd love to pull that off. So anyway, what I'd like to bottom line for you listeners in this podcast right now is two takeaways from neuroscience that help us with our writing. Number one, our brains think in pictures.
Mm.
And number two, our brains retain stories. So think with me for just a moment. Our brains do think in pictures, don't they? I mean, most of the time, not all the time, but 90% of people, if I say the word elephant to you, you don't picture the letters ELEPHANT. You picture big gray, pachyderm. And that's because God just wired our brains that way. So we need to leverage this when we write. We need to leverage this when we speak. Rather than just information, how do we get to painting a picture inside of them? And then we remember stories, don't we? Maybe think about that last great speech you heard. There might have been a handle, maybe a catchy phrase that speaker used, but my guess is you really remembered that closing story or that opening story. So we need to leverage this. We need to take advantage of this. And that's where we're going today with this. I want to give you some practical tips on the use of stories that you can use as you write for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I think it's so helpful. I want you to go right into that, Tim, if you don't mind. I mean, the day that we're in, this is so needed, this message, because we are there. It's a crowded space. There's a lot of messages flying around us. Talk to us about that. And even maybe if you're willing, I know you're not a neuroscientist, but you've studied a lot in that way. So I'd love to kind of glean from you along those lines.
Yeah, well, authors and potential authors listening, first of all, I want you to know what the competition is today. If you're writing to a person that happens to have a smartphone and they're on social media, which is probably over 90% of your people, they're consuming 10,000 messages a day. Now, that's not just social media. That's billboards, email, conversations, whatever. But if you add it all up together, your words that you're trying to get through their filter are up against 10,000 competitors. So good luck with that, right? I feel bad for teachers today in a classroom where the teenagers are on social media. They're going, how do I get through to these kids? Here's the term that I want you to understand. There's a neurological process inside of us called sensory gating. Sensory gating. And it's a natural process that our brains go through that filter out redundant or unnecessary information. So if you're taking in all these messages, your brain, just to keep you from getting overwhelmed, will practice sensory gating. It'll push out messages you don't think are relevant or message you think you already know. I already know that, Mom. That's why you say to your kids, I told you to clean your room 6 times. Did you not hear me? Well, they didn't, because it's unnecessary information. It's redundant. You already told me that, Mom. So I'm saying to you, you're writing to people who have very strong filters, because it's filtering just to keep our brains from getting overwhelmed. So the popular term for sensory gating is the cocktail party effect. Now, Jared, we've never talked about this, but you know what this means, don't you?
Sure.
Say you're at a party, you got your little drink, and you're holding your drink and you're just engaging in a conversation. But let's say there's 50 people in this room. Well, there's a lot of noise. And so your brain has to practice sensory gating, or the more popular term, the cocktail party effect, where you can hear the words of the person in front of you and you try to filter out or drown out all the other noise in that room. It's an automatic process, but it makes it tougher for a writer to get through. In other words, our brains have to have this, but man, it makes it tough for you to get through. The competition and the filters are really rough. So what actually gets through those filters easier than all the others? Well, it's two items. Imagery or metaphor is number one, imagery or metaphor. I'll double click on that in just a minute. And then number two, stories and narratives. C.S. Lewis called it getting past the watchful dragons. If people are getting information that they think they kind of already know or they've heard before, it's like a moat dragon in front of the castle that's not letting anything else in. But C.S. Lewis said, you tell a story, you're getting past those watchful dragons in the moat. You sneak past them because you do a story. That's why he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It was loaded with truth, deeper truth, but it was a story that was fun. You follow me? So I'm saying to you, image and metaphor gets through the moat dragon. When you paint a picture in the mind of your reader or speakers, your listener, suddenly your brain starts getting very active because it's attempting to imagine the words you're sharing. You know, the red wagon was pulled down the street, blah, 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 blah. But you can see it. So the more you can leverage imagery and metaphor, the more powerful and memorable your words are going to be. But secondly, stories and narratives. When I wrote the Habitude series, which, by the way, for me, not John Maxwell, but for me, is the best-selling thing I've ever written. 3 million kids have gone through these Habitudes books. But I think I know why. I don't think I said anything that's never been said before, but the way I share it is with images and stories. Every short chapter, and they're all short, it's anchored with an image. And then I tell stories and stories and stories. And it's teaching life skills and leadership, but I think it's potent. Again, I don't think I'm the first person that said you need to have character or you need to be disciplined or you need to be responsible to those 6th grade kids. But I do know this. I said it in a way that they'll remember. So I guess, listeners, what I'm saying to you right now is, how can you take that good message you've got and make it great? Because instead of just saying it, you're showing it. You follow me? You could just say this thing, but instead you're painting a picture inside of them with a story or with an image. So, Jared, I'll stop there and I'll let you follow.
Well, showing it is potent. You know, you just mentioned that word, the potency of your message. When you're in a party, the cocktail party effect that you talked about, it takes a lot of energy to focus on the other person that's right in front of you, you know, and in a lot of ways, the message has to be potent for you to hold your focus on it. And if you take that same picture and as you're writing your book, listeners, authors, aspiring authors, as you're writing your book, think about the person that's turning these pages. John Maxwell always teaches us, he says, hey, when you get to the end of the page, ask yourself, is this a page worth turning? Is the reader going to be bought in enough to turn this page? And that's the showing it and connecting with the reader's brain in the way that their brain is processing it with imagery, with metaphors, like you said, with stories that stick, with narratives that they can't put down. You know, these are techniques and tactics that are incredibly important and things that we certainly should be considering when we're developing books. Tim, I'd love for you to share, you know, for the listeners out there that are preparing to write their books or in the middle of writing their books, how can they get the most out of their stories? Give us some practical advice here on how we can get the most out of our stories.
The first book I ever wrote was 40 years ago in 1984. And I remember I began to learn the lesson I'm about to share. And then I've just built on it over the years. For me, I wasn't planning on necessarily teaching anybody anything about writing, but I discovered along the way that there are 4 levels of impact in stories, meaning there's a kind of story that's the most influential, and then second most, and then third most, and then fourth most. So listeners, if you're not driving and you can jot these down, I want to give you 4 levels of impact in stories. Okay. None of these are rocket science. You're going to immediately go, of course, yes. But when you see how they build on one another, I think that's when they become powerful. So the first most impactful type of story that you can tell is a personal, true story. John Maxwell and I both agree when we were taught to speak, we were told not to tell too many stories about ourselves because, in fact, John was taught, don't tell anything about yourself. It's going to come across arrogant or cocky or self-serving, but it's quite the opposite. Now, if you're writing a chapter, you shouldn't share 20 stories about yourself in 10 pages. But the most impactful story is the one that you're telling about you because the listener or the reader wants to identify with you. You're talking to them. So if I can tell a story about the plane crash I was in 1990, or this episode or that experience or whatever, it's just become much more winsome than telling about someone else. Okay. So potential authors, I would say I try in every chapter to tell 1 or 2 personal, true stories about myself. Now, I'm going to tell a lot of other stories too, but I try to insert them. And what I do when I insert them is I do this. I want the reader to know I'm engaging in this topic. It's not a theory to me. I did this, or I failed to do this. But either way, I'm showing them I tried to practice this principle that I'm sharing with you. Okay. So that's number 1, personal, true story. Number 2, the second most influential type of story is a true familiar story. Okay. So it's not a personal one, but it's about someone that every listener or reader would go, oh yeah, I know that person. Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or, what, Justin Timberlake. I don't know why I'm making this up right now, but the true familiar story is a story about a person they know. So they already find some common ground because they have some history and knowledge, but it's not you. Okay. So it's second most impactful. Number 3, the third most influential type of story would be the true yet unfamiliar story. So again, it's still a true story. So when you tell it, you can say this actually happened back in 2015, blah, 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 blah. But now it's they don't know this person. Okay. They're not really sure who it is, but at least they know this is a true story. So it's believable. I'll stay with you, Mr. Author or Miss Author. And then the fourth most impactful story is the fictional story. So the fictional story is obviously just that. It's fiction. It's better than no story, but it's not as good as a true story. Okay, you follow me? I mean, Jared, this would be the proverbial little fable that you might tell of, the frog was hopping down the road. He fell into a hole and he looked up and said to the squirrel, can you go get me help? Everybody listening or reading goes, okay, this is a fiction story. This is, the frog's talking. But you're letting the person know I'm about to illustrate something that's going to be very relevant for your life. I'm just happening to use a fable. So the truth of the matter is pictures tell stories. And all I'm simply saying is I'm giving you a level of impact to know along the way, this is going to help them retain what you've written and hopefully pass it on. Maybe pitch your book to someone else, along the way. So
Yeah.
I'm just a vivid believer in everything I just said. Yeah.
Well, I love the 4 levels of impact too. I love the thread through this whole episode, and that is connecting to the reader, connecting
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the audience. The thing that all of these principles we're giving you today have in common. The thing that each of these has in common is that we're teaching you how to connect to the reader, teaching you how to connect to the audience. It's personal. And when it's personal and it's true, they can connect, they can see themselves in it, they can identify with it. And there may be no more powerful force of connection than identification. When you identify with something, you can see yourself in it. And of course, when it's personal from the author and it's true, it's going to be much more identifiable for the reader and easier to connect. But everything we're sharing, I just wanted to highlight that, Tim, because the need to connect with the reader is
Yeah.
higher today than ever before, because it's a crowded space, and these are practical ways for you all that are listening to help connect with that audience that you've chosen.
Yeah, it's so true. In fact, while you were talking, I was just thinking about something Becky Nesbitt said with us from Forefront Books. She said, it's never been easier to write a book, but
Yeah,
it's never been harder to get that book published. And I
yeah,
think part of the reason is everything we're just talking about today. So yeah.
yeah. Tim, you have an illustration how powerful images, and so we were talking about this before we started recording. I'd love for you to share the story that you have on how powerful images and stories can be for the authors.
Absolutely. Well, Jared, I've not really talked much to you about this, but before I started my career doing what I'm doing now, I drew pictures. I drew editorial cartoons. I was a political cartoonist for a few years at the very, very front end of my adult life. And what got me into this, I was an art minor in college, but I began to hear stories about the power of images and stories, and how it relayed. Pictures are not only worth 1,000 words, but they relay a story. Every picture relays a story. So Thomas Nast, listeners, was the father of the modern day political cartoon. So if you open up a newspaper and you see, the editorial section, you see that one frame cartoon that's on a current cultural issue, and the artist is making a comment, right, on politics or culture or society or whatever. Well, Thomas Nast, way back in the 19th century, he not only developed our modern day Santa Claus picture with a red suit and the white beard, but he came up with the Democrat donkey and the Republican elephant. He
Wow.
came up with Uncle Sam, I want you for the military or whatever. He came up with all those things way back in the 19th century.
What did
So,
you come up with, Tim? What did,
well,
uh,
I wish I could tell you. I can't. I don't have anything. I do have my own style, but oh my
that's
gosh!
great.
But I
That's
tell you
great.
what, I loved doing those cartoons because I was able to tell a story in a picture. And it
Yes.
just took up like 4 inches by 4 inches on that editorial page for the. I did cartoons for 4 different cities, and had my own little syndicate. But I knew just by sending that picture, I was sending a message. And authors, this is what we're saying to you. You paint a picture on page 23, you did way more than just relay information. You gave them something to remember, and you gave them something to pass on. It's sticky and it's shareable. So Thomas Nast has an amazing story that will convince you of everything I just talked to you about the last 20 minutes or so. He lived in New York City, and during his day, the politicians in that city were horribly corrupt. And there was one particular politician that pretty much owned all the corporate America at the time. They owned the businesses. His name was Boss Tweed, and Boss Tweed had blackmail material on other politicians, on business leaders. And so he pretty much controlled the narrative and kept getting reelected over and over and over again because he had blackmail material. Well, people kind of knew he was corrupt, but when editorial writers would write on how corrupt he was, people didn't really pay attention because they weren't very literate back then. They weren't as literate as people are today. So they weren't reading the articles. That's when Thomas Nast said, I'm going to draw some pictures. And as a political cartoonist, he started drawing pictures of Boss Tweed in a very corrupt sort of way. I mean, you can say a lot in a picture. And they
Yep.
started seeing this conniving, deceiving politician in control. Like one of them was him holding up puppet strings on the city council or whatever. Well, the next election, Boss Tweed is not reelected.
Wow.
And he's famous for saying this. Boss Tweed said to his staff, I don't care about the articles. They don't read the articles, but we just can't stop those damn cartoons. That's what he said. And
Yeah.
the point
The
was
pictures.
the picture. the moment someone gave every person in that city a picture that told 1,000 words. That's what did it. So, authors, I'm saying this to you. You've got to get better and better and better at this. And Jared, you and I do too. We just need to keep getting better. But don't listen to people that say, "Oh, it's not very academic. It's not very, credible or whatever." Oh, it is, and it's the most memorable thing you can relay in a book. So I leave you with that.
So good, so helpful, leveraging the power of story and understanding that we are visual
Yeah,
beings at our core, at our wiring, and even in our conditioning.
yeah,
So we have to meet the audience there. We share. I just want to highlight one more time what you said earlier, Tim. Our brains think in pictures, and they retain stories.
yeah,
So as you authors, aspiring authors, as you're working on your books, your written materials, we want to encourage you. It is possible to leverage the power of stories. They don't always have to be intimately connected to your story, but when they're personal and when they're true, they're even more impactful. So dig deep, find what those stories are that your audience needs to hear, and find a way to make them imagery, find a way to use metaphors, find a way to use pictures, and it's going to stick even that much more. So we're grateful for you being here. We can't wait for the next episode. If we're impacting you, let us know. If there's something you'd love for us to cover, we would love to hear about it. But until next time, the world needs the book in you.